So, time then for your Saturday evening press preview. It's our first look at what is on tomorrow's front pages. And tonight we'll be checking out those headlines with former No10 speechwriter Asa Bennett and journalist and broadcaster Jenny Kleeman. Great to see you both. We'll chat in a moment. We're going to have a look at those front pages for you. One story pretty much dominating. We'll start with the Sunday Express, leading on football shows being forced off air at the BBC after high-profile presenters and pundits as well all walked out in solidarity with Gary Lineker. The Sunday Telegraph leads on the BBC's Director General refusing to resign over the row. Same story on the front of the Sunday Times. And the Observer, their headline, Lineker row threatens to topple BBC chiefs and hit asylum plan. While the Mail reports on the reaction from Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, who said it's a matter for the BBC, not the government. Here's tomorrow's Star, leading with off, off, off. Lineker, I'll never be silenced. The Mirror leads with Gary's messages to the Beeb. And don't forget, you can scan the QR code that you can see on screen right now and join the programme. Check out those front pages while you watch us discussing them. And I am joined tonight by Asa Bennett and Jenny Kleeman. Lovely to see you both this Saturday evening. And it's interesting, isn't it? One story dominating every single front page. It does happen from time to time, but pretty rare. Just shows, doesn't it, how the last 24 hours this story has exploded. Jenny, looking at the Sunday Express, BBC Sport, blackout, still on air, match of the day, but looking incredibly different tonight.
Yes, match of the day with no commentary, no punditry, no presenters. Perhaps some people are switching over from match of the day to watch us, where we're going to have some real commentary on this tonight.
Let's hope so.
One of many programmes that isn't running as expected today. Football Focus, final score pulled from the schedules. 5 Live's football coverage significantly reduced today. I mean, what a crisis this is for the BBC. If BBC bosses hoped that they would be drawing a line under this furore yesterday when they said Lineker wouldn't be presented, they showed terrible misjudgment. This is what some have been calling the I am Sporticus moment, this invisible picket line that sports presenters would be fools to cross because there is such a momentum behind supporting Gary Lineker, certainly among sports presenters. Spare a thought for the poor BBC staff, many of whom are freelance behind the scenes, who will be taking a hit for this, who won't be paid, or maybe they will be paid, but who won't be able to work today. I read that they can't pull match of the day because the BBC is contractually obliged to show highlights from the Premier League. So instead, it's this very strange, silent programme without commentary. This is humiliating and embarrassing for the BBC, and everybody is going to notice because you either follow, well, maybe some people follow all of it, but the people who follow football will notice, the people who follow politics will notice, the people who follow the news will notice. So this is such a disaster, so misjudged, so badly handled by the BBC. And, this all seemed to be blowing over, I thought, by Friday morning. Why did the BBC inflict this wound upon themselves so late? The BBC has undermined its own credibility in their mishandling of all of this. They totally didn't anticipate that this was going to happen.
Yeah, Ace, front of the Daily Star just puts it into sharp focus. Off, off, off. Football Focus, final score, Radio 5 footy, player interviews, Mark Chapman, Kelly Summers, Gary Lineker, Jason Mohammed. This is a crisis now, isn't it, for the BBC, which they could have avoided, like Jen is saying.
Absolutely. For the BBC, it's very much a self-inflicted crisis. It's one where they thought they could, blow the whistle on Gary Lineker, send him off for, keep him on the subs bench while they just let things cool down, perhaps. But in essence, everyone else has then rushed off to join him. It is that sort of strike action, practically. What's particularly bizarre with it is for days, and indeed longer than this, the BBC has maintained that what matters is if it's news presenters being impartial, and that sports and others are more than entitled to have their own opinions, off air. That's why, for example, Lord Sugar, with his business programme, he's able to tweet and endorse candidates at election time while still presenting a BBC show. That's why, Chris Packham, an environmentalist, is able to still tweet on all sorts of campaign interests. Fergal Sharkey, they're still involved in BBC shows. But at this point, I suspect the dam broke because Lineker is so box office. He is the BBC's best paid presenter that they felt they needed to make an example of him. But in that process, they've opened up a real can of worms now, because the BBC gets to do what it loves doing best, which is debating itself and realizing that it has to set its policy in gear now of what it actually means for impartiality for everyone, not just the news staff.
But the issue, Jenny, is, if you look at it from a very basic level, the BBC has impartiality rules. If you read the rules, Gary Lineker has broken them. That's black and white, isn't it? The question is, I guess, are the impartiality rules good enough, or do they need rewriting? And I suppose that's one way that the BBC could step back from this, is it?
Well, I think the impartiality rules aren't very black and white, and they're applied very inconsistently. A lot of people were sharing on social media today responses they'd had from the complaints unit when they'd complained, for example, about Andrew Neil or about Chris Packham, political statements they'd made on Twitter. And the responses they got from the BBC were, these people are freelance, they are tweeting in a personal capacity, and the BBC impartiality rules don't apply in that respect. And in fact, they said as much when Gary Lineker, the last time there was a furore about Gary Lineker expressing his opinions. I understand that the BBC impartiality rules have been tightened since then, and there is some relevance given to how big a star you are. But I think a lot of this comes down to the fact that he is the best paid person at the BBC. And so there's a particular focus on him, but he's a sports pundit. The idea that he's influencing public opinion on politics, if he was that influential,
he does have 8 million followers though, doesn't he?
Leicester City. We'd all be supporting Leicester City. Do you know what I mean? He shares his opinions on that as well. Yes, he has a lot of followers, and yes, he's paid a lot of money. But I think the problem is that these rules are not very clear, and if they are clear, they're not being applied in a consistent way. So nobody knows where they stand.
OK, front of the Mail on Sunday, Asa, Prime Minister hits back in Lineker storm. A bit like Tim Davie, actually, the Director General, hasn't said anything for the last 24 hours or so, but they did both break their silence a bit earlier on today. What did you make of what the Prime Minister had to say?
Well, I think the Prime Minister was trying to take it back to first principles, and why we must remember this whole argument began is because Gary Lineker waded in with his opinion on what the government is doing to stop the boats coming over the English Channel, to deal with illegal migration. And so the Prime Minister and his team are then trying to bring it back to the big, wider relative problem, saying that, yes, they want Gary Lineker and the BBC to sort themselves out. They'll leave them to it. They want nothing but the best. But that we have to remember, the scale of the problem we face here, and that this is why the government's determined to do what matters, and as is one of our big priorities. I think from a comms angle, essentially it is that every day the government's talking about its priorities, like this thing on stopping the boats, it then would view it's winning the air war. Every day they're talking about something else, like Gary Lineker or BBC impartiality rules, or whether actually the BBC Director General should resign. They are not cutting through. So that's why he wants to try and bring it back to what he wants to talk about.
And just staying with you briefly, Asa, do you think the government, as it's been criticised, does put undue pressure on the BBC?
So I think obviously the Prime Minister has been very careful not to criticise the BBC or Gary Lineker on this. They are staying out of the fray. I think, by contrast, there are Tory MPs who've been writing to the BBC and piling on the pressure, and I think that may be also what forced Auntie to try and throw a bone to the critics.
OK, and the front of the Sunday Telegraph, Jenny, I won't quit, says BBC boss. He hints at a climb down. Let's just have a look at what he said. I mean, he's obviously hoping for a resolution. He says the right outcome would be to get him back on air. Both seem to be digging in, though. How do you think this is going to be resolved?
It was one of these extraordinary things where the BBC interviews the BBC and says, oh, it's an exclusive. We've got an exclusive interview with the Director General of the BBC. Yeah. I think they need to reinstate Gary Lineker immediately. They need to clarify the guidelines. They need to stop being cowed by the Tories and the Daily Mail, because this was a victory for the Daily Mail. And they need to address the issues with the Tory chairman, Richard Sharp, who is himself embroiled in a complicated investigation. He chairs the board that is deciding on the Gary Lineker situation, and he himself is under investigation for failing to disclose that he was acting as a go-between when Boris Johnson was in financial difficulty and looking for a loan. You have to remember that Tim Davie, when he took the Director General job in 2020, he said impartiality was his number one priority. So you would think that he would have some clarity on all of this. He's going to be under a lot of pressure over the next few days. In the comments that he made in this interview today, he was really, it says in the piece here, extending an olive branch to Gary Lineker. You know, you could say that he was flattering him greatly, saying that he was the greatest sports broadcaster in the world. He clearly wants this situation to be diffused, but, you know, it's got a momentum now that I think the BBC never really considered. And, you know, we should be talking about the government's immigration policy, illegal immigration policy, which the government itself accepts is probably breaking international law. And instead, we're talking about the BBC. It is quite an absurd situation to be in. And this is all because BBC management has handled it so badly.
Yeah, we've just got 30 seconds to show one more paper front of the Mirror. Lineker, I'll never be silenced. They've got the extra detail that he's going to be eating cottage pie this evening instead of watching Match of the Day. Cottage pie, not humble pie, Asa. And same question to you, really. How do you think this is all going to end?
Well, basically, the BBC is going to have a mealy-mouthed apology. And Gary, he's not going to be deleting his Twitter account anytime soon. That's what we'll know.
So he's going to stay on the BBC, you reckon?
Very much so.
Yeah.
You know, but to be fair, he can always fall back on other things, like his sideline as a crisp salesman or his work as a podcasting mogul.